Hello and welcome back to the history of Bangalore. I am Ramjee Chandran and we are now in episode 91. And this is part 2 of my mini-series on Hyder Ali, whose history we have been taught, but in patches over the years. And I will try to make it more comprehensive and much more interesting. Mainly because what Hyder Ali did with Bengaluru was astonishing. He rebuilt the fort, turned the Pete from a market town into a military-industrial complex, and right outside the fort walls, he built the first cantonment in Bengaluru, decades before the British did. But before all that fascination, a word of thanks to the Prestige Group, whose sponsorship makes this podcast possible. Building cities one landmark at a time, they transform dreams into reality. You can be a part of the future. Simply add prestige to your life. When Hyder Ali received Bengaluru as a personal Jagir in 1759, there was no public proclamation, there was no ceremony marking the change. The city simply entered a new phase, one that was practical, sustained, and methodical, like the city has always been from the date of its founding. But because of that, it was also mutable, which means it was adaptable to change, and that would alter how it functioned and what it was for. Hyder Ali knew Bengaluru very well. He had campaigned around Bengaluru, and he had used the fort as a military sanctuary when he was in danger of assassination, as you remember from the last episode. He had relied on its market for supply during his campaigns, so his interest in Bengaluru was not abstract or convenient, it was personal. And his first priority as a military man was the Bengaluru Fort. The oval-shaped one that Chikka Devaraja had built inside the Pete was in mud and no longer adequate for defense needs. Hyder Ali ordered its complete reconstruction in stone. The new fort retained the oval plan, but it was enlarged, fitted with round towers and cavaliers, that those were raised artillery platforms that were designed to allow guns to fire over the main ramparts. The moat was deepened, and he filled the moat with extremely tough thorny hedges which are very, very difficult to cross, especially by cavalry. The fort had two principal gates which merited a lot of attention from Hyder. This is the Delhi gate to the north and the Mysore gate to the south, and these were reinforced with outer works and ramparts of their own. These gates in a fort were not merely entrances because they controlled the movement of men, animals, and goods. By strengthening them, Hyder Ali tightened control over everything that moved in and out of the city, and especially the fort. The Delhi Gate is still visible today. It is also the point where the British breached the fort in 1791, and there's a plaque on the wall, but the details of that campaign are a story for a later episode. The Pete to the north of the fort was not neglected either. He cut a deep ditch around it, and inside it, he planted these thick hedges of thorn that I had mentioned along its perimeter as a defensive barrier, and this worked actually extremely well against the Maratha cavalry. Thorny bushes might appear crude, but they were effective. They slowed raids, channeled movement, and bought time. Now, even when we go trekking, we try to avoid thorns as much as we can because we know how difficult it is to get through them. Now, when they are planted to thwart people and animals, you can imagine how effective that would have been. The Pete was now explicitly a part of the city's defensive system. Now, this was no longer some sort of civilian appendage to the fort as it has been. Kempegowda had always built fortifications around the Pete, but the gates were designed for easy access, easy in and out, and not to thwart people. Hyder Ali brought it into the realm of defense and strengthened all of these things. This would come to play in 1791, where the British had to mount a separate campaign just to take the Pete. The Bengaluru Pete was designed as a market town. The feeling inside the Pete, other than living in religion and culture, was principally one of commerce. That was what dominated it. There were a few places that manufactured goods, but these were more in the nature of soft goods. Looms, for example, for silks and cotton, or basket weaving, or threading flowers together. Now Hyder Ali established in it a military industrial complex. He set up a mint for coinage, and he set up a foundry that produced brass cannons. He also established a boring machine, and that was powered by a pair of bullocks, according to the chronicler Edward Moore, who wrote these descriptions some decades later in 1794. And that machine, the boring machine powered by two bullocks, could bore 50 muskets and a cannon simultaneously. And lest we should think that a pair of bullocks walking around in circles attached to a boring machine was somewhat crude, Edward Moore also recorded that the guns produced in the Bengaluru Pete were comparable to any in the world for precision and engineering. This precision and engineering was admittedly something that the Europeans had bought, and that happened principally because Hyder Ali employed a large number of Frenchmen who were experts, French artisans, engineers, who set up and supervised the production lines. They introduced European routines and methods of metallurgy and drilling. They trained the local workers in matters of process control and quality control. Thus, they reduced Mysore's dependence on imported arms by manufacturing it right here in the Pete. Hyder Ali named his factory Taramandala, and the production area was located in a part of the Pete that was named after it, called Taramandala Pete. Now, Taramandala means constellation, and the Bengaluru Taramandala was one of 4 such production facilities that Hyder Ali established in the Mysore kingdom. The others were in Srirangapatna, Chitradurga, and Bidanur. Each of these Taramandalas had the capacity to produce approximately 1 cannon and 5 or 6 high-quality muskets and 1,000 swords per month. And over the years of Hyder Ali and Tipu Sultan, these Taramandalas, these factories, produced, in addition to muskets, cannons, and swords, produced rockets, and interestingly, consumer goods like hourglasses, scissors, and pocket knives, such things that we take for granted these days. I mentioned rockets. The rockets deserve a moment of their own. The Mysore rocket, as it came to be called, was not an ordinary incendiary device. Gunpowder and encasing gunpowder in a projectile was not new. Earlier rockets, the Chinese ones and the European ones, had used casings of paper and bamboo. The difference is that the Mysore rocket used metal. That simple change allowed a much greater pressure, a greater range, and a greater consistency. Now, this technology was not invented by Hyder Ali or his men, and the roots of rocketry, even in India, go back several centuries, but the Mysore rocket was distinct in its perfection, in the fact that it could be produced at scale and repeatedly, and its transformation into a weapon of war capable of changing the outcome of a battle happened first in the Bengaluru Pete, in the factories of Bengaluru and Srirangapatna, and then the others. It is important to understand how devastating the Mysore rocket was. As I will explain in detail in a later episode, the Mysore rocket decimated the British in the Battle of Polilur in 1780. The British had not experienced a rocket attack, anything like this, and so they studied and adapted it for their own manufacture and called it the Congreve rocket system. And then they used it in the Napoleonic Wars and, importantly, in the American War of Independence in 1812. And here, I need to make specific mention of the American War of Independence and how the Mysore rocket wound up featuring in the American national anthem. Maybe not directly, but here's how. It happened in 1814, during the British bombardment of Fort McHenry during the Battle of Baltimore in September 1814. A lawyer turned poet, Francis Scott Key, witnessed the attack from a ship. What he saw inspired him to write a poem titled The Defense of Fort McHenry, and before long, the verses of that poem were used as the lyrics for the national anthem of the United States, the Star-Spangled Banner. Watching this battle from a truce ship in the Baltimore harbor, Key saw that the British used what they called the Congreve rockets, firing them from the battleship HMS Erebus, creating bright, streaking red trails with explosive or incendiary devices that lit up the night sky with a reddish glow. By these intermittently red flares, he could see that the American flag was still flying over the fort despite the battering that the fort was receiving. Moved, this sight filled him with patriotism, and Francis Scott Key wrote his poem, and the first verse of that poem included these lines: "And the rocket's red glare, the bombs bursting in air, gave us proof through the night that our flag was still there." That rocket and its red glare were nothing but the so-called Congreve rockets that were fired by the British. The ones that inspired the American national anthem were no more than modifications, improvements if you want, on Hyder Ali's Mysore rockets made in the Bengaluru Pete. And to this day, it is no accident that Bengaluru remains the center of defense science in the country. And now it's time for a commercial break, and when I get back, let's talk about the arrival of the French hussars and the very first cantonment of Bengaluru. Right after this.
Maximum connectivity, maximum luxury, maximum lifestyle. Live your max at Prestige Raintree Park. Opulent residences nestled in 21 acres of breathtaking landscape with 1 lakh plus square feet of clubhouse, 3 swimming pools, and ample leisure and sports amenities. Experience exquisite living at Prestige Raintree Park in prime Whitefield with schools, offices, hospitals, and shopping malls just a hop away. Call 81399 or visit prestigeconstructions.com to know more. Radar approved.
Setting up a weapons manufacturing unit was not merely a matter of installing a few drilling and boring machines. A defense production unit always was something vastly more involved than some kind of an industrial shed. The defense production area and the presence of the fort meant that there was a need to garrison troops, and that meant having to get the necessary troops to garrison and train. So Bengaluru also became a primary recruitment center for Hyder Ali's army. Able-bodied men from the surrounding territories came to the city seeking enlistment, pay, and protection. The city's population started to grow as a result of all this, and it didn't grow evenly. Military labor and its supporting services obviously expanded much faster than the artisanal or mercantile occupations of tradition. New neighborhoods started to appear in response. Outside the Pete area, across the moat from the Delhi gate, Hyder Ali created an area called Kalasi Palaya. Kalasis were people who put up tents. They were the tent people, and these tents housed armies. So Kalasi Palaya housed cavalry barracks and stables. In effect, Bengaluru's first cantonment was in Kalasi Palaya, not the British cantonment that would come decades later. And that is a different story coming up in later episodes, but this was Hyder Ali's cantonment. Kalasi Palaya was a military quarter embedded into the Pete's urban fabric. It was subject to military law, it served the army's operational needs, and Kalasi Palaya was where Bangalore's military character first became physically permanent. Nearby, another area called Korachapalaya was established to house grooms and cattle keepers and those responsible for maintaining the army's livestock. Now, these were functional extensions of the war system and Kalasi Palaya itself. So war was no longer an interruption to urban life, it was built into it. Any military machine needs money, and Hyder Ali understood that commercial life of the Pete was not separate from his military objectives, but the foundation of them. So he did not dismantle the revenue systems that he had inherited from earlier Wadiyar rule. So he improved them. Some archaic taxes were examined in detail and thrown out. Those that produced no useful revenues were abolished, but some, even though they appeared absurd, such as that tax on animals with tails called the Bala Terige, were nevertheless retained because they produced steady income. Revenue was the priority. Ideology came second. So under the new systems, road tolls were systematically collected on goods entering and leaving the markets. Large scales, weighing scales, were installed in Dodapete to facilitate the weighing of cotton, areca nut, which we wrongly call betel nut, and other bulk goods. Now, all of these measures had a clear purpose. They were to make Bengaluru function as a regulated trade emporium, to give the merchants reliable standards and give the state a reliable income. Hyder's commercial thinking was ambitious, and it extended way beyond the Pete, way beyond the plateau, way beyond the South Indian Peninsula. Hyder established trading factories in Oman to facilitate overseas commerce. Now, the word factory in this context means something very different from manufacturing facilities. I've heard it said, or I read it somewhere, that Hyder Ali and Tipu Sultan set up armaments factories in Oman, but that is not really true. These factories were trading offices. They were a commercial outpost, a center where factors or accountants kept records and managed trade relationships. So these Omani factories gave Mysore a presence in the Gulf network. Combined with the navy that Hyder was building on the Canara coast, this was the beginning of Mysore as a maritime commercial power, not just as an inland military state. Hyder Ali's approach to social regulation and religious strictures was equally pragmatic. He permitted the sale of arak, country liquor, even ganja in Bengaluru. Not celebrated, not encouraged, but permitted so that it could be taxed. One Mysore official writing of this period observed that the regulated sale of alcohol and drugs produced considerable revenue to the state. In a kingdom permanently short of funds and engaged in an almost continuous war, that observation was not without its significance. This was governance by practicality. Any activity that could not realistically be eliminated was brought under regulation and tax. Any regulation that produced income was retained and maintained, no matter how absurd it might seem. Hyder Ali tolerated in order to govern. He taxed so that he could fight. And this is in contrast with his son Tipu Sultan, who would later pursue a policy of prohibition and enforcement driven entirely by his religious convictions, and that difference was sharp. Hyder Ali's approach served Bengaluru's commercial character. Tipu Sultan's approach would strain it. In 1761, after the fall of Pondicherry to the British, 300 French hussars were horse-mounted troops, under Lieutenant Colonel Hugel, entered Hyder Ali's services and came to Bengaluru. Along with them came skilled armorers and artificers from the Pondicherry arsenal, engineers, craftsmen, and weapon specialists. And now, there was the first European garrison ever to be stationed in Bengaluru. These men were not visitors. They were embedded troops. They organized artillery units, established arsenals and workshops, and introduced European routines of manufacture and inspection, quality control. French officers moved between their encampments and the markets of the Pete. They learned fragments of Kannada and Persian in order to conduct daily transactions. Some of them learned enough to issue orders without the presence of interpreters. The French integration was genuine. It always had been different in character from the studied distance that would later mark British relations with the city. Indeed, in his writings, Colonel Blackiston remarked that the French were considerably more egalitarian in their relations with the natives than the British were, because the British were standoffish and aloof. And now, the Tower of Babel in Bengaluru Pete had another tongue. If you think about it, Kempegowda's first Pete had Kannada as the mother tongue, of course, but from the beginning, a generous mix of Tamil and Telugu speakers. And then the Bijapur Sultanates and the Mughals had infused Persian into the official languages as well as Arabic. And the development of Rekhta, as you might know from a previous episode, had introduced Dakhni, and Shahaji Bhonsle had made Marathi an official language. And now there were French troops from the garrison walking around the Pete, doing their best to learn Kannada, Dakhni and Persian, and I'm sure giving everyone a good taste of French. Some accounts also described how Hyder Ali and Tipu Sultan had specifically given areas to the French where they built a little township that was more in the style of European towns with broader streets and larger plot sizes for homes and independent residential units. And so the French built residential areas that suited their own habits and, let's call it, their own Shastras. The arrival of Heugel's force marked a turning point. French collaboration with Mysore now shifted from the battlefield assistance to a structural component of the state. This regiment would fight alongside Mysore, under Hyder and then under Tipu, right until the very end in 1799. After the fall of Srirangapatna, the French soldiers were repatriated. Their officers retired, some went to Pondicherry, and what remained of their presence in Mysore is a small, largely forgotten cemetery at Pandavapura, which is about 130 kilometers southwest of Bengaluru. It is a place known as French Rocks, and barring the presence of the tombs of several Frenchmen, there's nothing around. By the time Hyder Ali had completed his transformation of the city, Bengaluru was no longer what it had been. Kempegowda, as we know, founded it as a market town. The Marathas had administered it as a jagir, and what they brought in were methods of administration, a new language, and culture of their own. Chikka Devaraja had configured Bengaluru as the first line of defense. He had worked out that when the attacks came, they would come from the north, and if Bengaluru was properly provisioned to create a defense, it would remain that much more of a barrier, preventing the troops from hitting the capital, Srirangapatna. Hyder Ali turned this into something that none of his predecessors had conceived: a military-industrial city, a recruiting base, an arsenal, a manufacturing center, a commercial emporium, and a cantonment which included a military garrison housing the first European soldiers ever to be stationed in Bengaluru. The pete was still the pete. People haggled with vendors every morning and went about their daily business. But Bengaluru had not merely come into adulthood, it had been transformed into something the rest of the world would have reason to notice. And in Baltimore that day, they did. In my next episode, I follow what Hyder Ali's Bengaluru might have looked to the whole world, and I tell you about how he became the unlikely hero of the American War of Independence. That episode is coming right up. Stay tuned. I am Ramjee Chandran, and this is the history of Bangalore.